This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
indylive.radio.
Hi there, and welcome to Ken Bates's Conversations. As you know, each week I speak to new Scots about their journey to Scotland and life since they've lived here. This week we moved to the East Coast and up to Aberdeen, where I was joined by Elijah. I started, of course, by asking him about life before he came to Scotland.
A little more complicated than most, I think. I was actually born in Oxford, but my parents are Swiss and American. They were studying there. They were doing their postgraduates. And I was born in Oxford, and we left when I was 2 years old. I didn't get British citizenship or anything at the time. And I grew up in New York and then in Switzerland. And when I finished high school, I got into uni in Aberdeen through the access course, which I don't know if they do it anymore. It was like a sort of 2-month summer thing for people who'd had various issues with their finishing high school, or who maybe didn't have the full-on qualifications for uni access, or who were maybe mature students coming back and, you know, things had changed since they'd left, or they had professional experience that would kind of help them get into uni. So I did that, and I've been here in Aberdeen ever since. It's been 10 years now. I came up in 2010. But yeah, I've pretty much just growing up in Switzerland for my formative years, not doing too well in high school, bouncing around a little bit, really needing to get away because it's a small place with not a lot going on, especially if you're like a musician or you're interested in the arts and culture and, like, you know, doing stuff actively. And Aberdeen was very good for me. It was really cool that I was able to get into a university in Scotland without necessarily having to go through the, you know, one single track, right? So that, like, there's other ways of accessibility for people with kind of different backgrounds, and of course for free, which was.
Is there any particular reason why did you specifically choose Scotland, or is it just luck of the draw in that respect?
Well, I really wanted to go to university somewhere where I could speak my native language, which is English. I wasn't having the best time trying to put my thoughts to paper in Italian or German or whatever it was where I was growing up. I also just wanted to move away from the kind of Central European cultural approach, which sometimes I miss a little bit now, but, you know. And honestly, it was just looking at the tuition fees and the various costs and the various ways to get in. Scotland was just the kind of, you know, it was the most obvious sort of approach, because it was free. And then Aberdeen had this access course. Because what happened to me is right before my high school exams, my final exams, I got peritonitis, which is a nasty infection in your appendix. It nearly burst. I could have died. I was bedridden for about a month, and I just missed my exams. And then the retake option was this whole thing. It was a mess, but we'd gotten an offer from Aberdeen saying we have an access course that you can come and do if you don't have high school exams. So I went and did that, and I got into uni that way, which was great.
What did you study?
I started. I did a couple of things. I ended up settling on sociology and international relations as a joint degree, and the idea was to then go into politics as a career, which hasn't panned out at all, which I'm kind of thankful for, because after my undergrad, I fucked around for about a year and went to do a postgrad certificate in journalism at Robert Gordon University, which was just not good. I was at my work placement. I wasn't enjoying it. It's not fun being a journalist. It's a terrible job having to, like, interact with the sort of power structures in British journalism. And I was at a gig one night on a weekend on my night off, and I was just, you know what? I've been doing music my whole life alongside it, so we'll just bin this and we'll go do music. So I dropped out, and I started putting work into setting myself up properly as a performer and a teacher. So I just started doing music full time, teaching kids during the week and playing in pubs on the weekend. And I make about as much as I would make in your average sort of entry level job anyway, but I've got more free time, and I've got sort of avenues for creativity and stuff that I can focus on, like what my personal interests are, rather than having to do 40 hours a week and always be, sort of like on the hook. So it's ended up being much better than what the original plan was.
Going back to when you first arrived in Scotland, tell us a bit about your first impressions of the country. Obviously, I mean, you say you were born in Oxford. Were you in Oxford long enough and in the UK long enough to sort of remember it, or were you very young when you moved to Switzerland?
No, we left when I was 2 years old. So there's really nothing in that kind of period that had any formative effect on me. And we left New York when I was 4 years old. So that kind of didn't really latch on either. I mean, when you first show up, there's obviously, I think the first reaction people have is a little bit colored by the kind of almost the twee sort of global cultural understanding of Scotland. It's a little bit defined by your Bravehearts and your tartans and your bagpipes, and it's all a bit, kind of sort of a stereotype, superficial kind of understanding of it, which didn't actually disappear that quick. I think people here are quite happy to kind of play into it a little bit when they meet someone who's like newly arrived. It's fun. It's a bit, and I had friends who were from like Glasgow or Aberdeen or Edinburgh who would like take me out to the pub and explain what the football stuff was, and like why it was important that this match was happening this way, and sort of what's the deal with the whole cultural connections behind the various sort of things, and what are people like? It was good. I had some people to just kind of give me some hints and some advice here and there about, just like how to react to some things that you might not necessarily get if you're coming from a Central European country. There's, certain types of people and certain types of just things that happen to you that you might not get anywhere else. And you might be like, well, what the fuck is that? How do I deal? What's my reaction here? But it was good. I had good friends who were very, very happy to just kind of sort of help me out. I started working in like an old manny's pub, and I had to learn how to speak Doric, the dialect up here in Aberdeen, because they're in their 70s and 80s and they're retired fishermen, and they'll grumble a quick short answer at you in the thickest Doric, and if you don't, or something else which is a bit nastier, then they'll leave. So you have to kind of clock on fast.
So I suppose, was the accent an issue and all that, and the Doric and all that? Did it sort of sound like almost like a foreign language completely to you?
No, absolutely not. The opposite, because I grew up speaking Swiss German and Italian in Switzerland, and Swiss German is quite similar to Scots, and especially to Doric in the kind of way it feels around the mouth. There's a lot of ch's and a lot of k's, like these short, sharp sounds. And a lot of the sort of instinct in terms of phrase and the way you might express something is very similar. And I think growing up multilingual, I've got this code switching thing where depending on who I'm talking to or sort of where I am, you'll start absorbing what's around you. And it didn't take long. After like a few years, I sounded more like a local. And when I go back home and talk to my mother, she sounds entirely different to me and from the way I used to sound. And she'll, so to her, I sound like a foreigner now, like I'm, from somewhere else. So it just kind of comes together as this like big sort of cultural sponge thing. It's not something I tried actively to do. It just kind of happened, and now it's really hard to not sound the way I sound.
Yeah, I can hear at least two accents within your voice. I can hear the Aberdeen, and then I can hear American as well. So it sort of depends on the words, but you can as an Englishman who's who's got I can sort of hear the differences in the accent. I don't think I'm ever going to lose this English accent. I mean, I start picking up some of the expressions and the terms where I am. I'm down in southwest Scotland here, so I sort of pick things up. But a friend of mine says that she can sometimes hear a Scottish twang to my accent. I'm like, well, I don't know where you got that from, but it's inevitable, really, I guess, really. But that's. Did you find Scotland? You talked about it. And a lot of people I've spoken to have said they found Scotland a very welcoming country, and that people here are incredibly friendly. I know that you're living in a city. Is that did you have a similar experience? Because a lot of people I've spoken to live in small communities, and obviously their experience being different. How was it for you?
It was really good. I I very quickly sort of found a couple of communities that I could go along with and sort of participate with and engage with, whether it was like music-based stuff or sort of university-based stuff, university-based stuff kind of things. And I did sort of live alone for a while, and I found that it was really easy to just like go out by myself on a night out and just like meet people and chat to them and have a good time. It's maybe a little bit easier for me than it would be for someone else because I'm like 6'6".
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, it was very welcoming. I don't think I experienced any kind of bigotry until quite a few years of being here. And even then it was accidental because they didn't know I was foreign. Yeah, I was working in a pub and one of the regulars was sounding off about Eastern Europeans and immigrants coming over and taking jobs. And I was like, mate, hi, I'm right here. He hadn't clocked, which was funny. And then he was a bit red-faced when he found out. But no, honestly, it's been very good. Being a European migrant in the UK for now and for the past sort of 5 years has been a little bit of a headache, as you can imagine. There's the various stresses related to getting your settled status thing, and just the sort of growing worry that you might just not be entirely safe. I mean, I've got settled status, but there's no physical paper trail for it, right? It's just an email with a document. And the current government has a habit of losing important documents for migrants and sending them off on, back to where they came from, whether they speak the language or not. All the Windrush documents just vanished. I would not be surprised if at some point a bunch of settled status stuff disappears as well, depending on what the political sort of scenario at the time is. So you deal with this kind of this contradicting vibe where you don't feel very safe being where you are necessarily, because there is a danger that, just like that, and things happen so quickly nowadays, there might be a situation which does put my ability to live here at risk. And at the same time, there's a devolved context which is very sort of adamant and actively encouraging about the fact that it's a good thing that I'm here and that I am welcome here and that I should stay here. And I'm like, that's great, but there's not that much you can do if a decision gets made at the national level. So yeah, that obviously ties into a few issues that I think we'll talk about later on. But
I mean, the opinions of the Scottish government completely contradict the way that the UK government are seeing things, which leads us, really into politics. You say you've had a long-standing interest in politics. What do you think of the comparison? Compare the Scottish government at Holyrood and the UK government at Westminster and the way that they operate.
So when I came here, I thought I had a interesting sort of outsider perspective. And it seemed to me fairly obvious that there was a big democratic deficit between the political culture of Scotland, the electoral returns, and how that translates to an actual, what's meant to be a democratic, inclusive form of government in Westminster. So there's a disconnect there, which to me was very obvious and very visible. And not being like from the UK, not having been born or grown up in a British context, I get spared some of the innate kind of chauvinism that you get from just being British. And it happens all the time. Everyone gets it. There's a certain aspect of the British psyche, whether it's English or Scottish or, that's just a little bit solipsistic and just a bit kind of weird from my perspective as a continental.
Give me some examples. I'd like.
Okay, so I'm pretty far left in politics. I would call myself a socialist or a communist, depending on who I'm talking to. And I have like a lot of I've met a lot of people who share my politics in various groups, who will have a good position on, for example, different international sort of issues and liberation movements. But as soon as it comes close to home, maybe with Northern Ireland or the Troubles, they start prevaricating, and there's this whole kind of instinct to make excuses and to sort of just sound a bit more liberal about what your opinions are and like what the moral sort of course of action is. I usually have quite a few going on because it's something I rage about quite, fairly often. Of course, I'm blanking at the moment. But yeah, I mean, even with the sort of EU referendum, I was talking to people who were on the left who were advocating to leave, and there's a solipsism there as well, because all their arguments about why the European Union should be criticized from a left-wing perspective, a lot of which I share and I understand, to me doesn't lead to the leave the EU solution, right? And there's this solipsism at play about how a Britain outside the EU, a potential leftist Britain, right? If you imagine a strong British state with a left-wing socialist government, is not going to be effective at countering those issues in the EU that left-wing leave people were criticizing, and rightly so. And there's just this aversion to being, I guess, European or being international. And I'm not trying to conflate being European with the EU, because I've got my views on the EU. I don't come from an EU country, but I'm here because of various EU sort of issues. But this kind of imagined power that the UK has as a global entity, that even people on the left who should know better just sometimes, I don't know if they forget, or if it's just like this kind of British psyche thing kicking in, where just, yeah.
The word great in Britain, of course, Great Britain. Yeah. I think it harps back to the days of almost like the good old days of the empire, maybe.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
Psyche maybe of people in this group of nations. Do you think?
Yeah, nominative determinism might be at play there. As a retracted one. I mean, all it means, of course, is that it's just the largest of the isles in the British Isles area. But yeah, I definitely have an issue with the sort of underlying kind of solipsism and chauvinism, even among supposed comrades. But that's maybe a much bigger topic than we should be getting into. Just
well, the rise of populism, and populist politics, as it's called, has made all the difference when you got. Boris Johnson down in Westminster and some of the stuff that he's going on about, and they seem to be kind of very fearful of the Scottish independence referendum. They seem to be doing anything they can to promote the union and going on about the union, and saying that the yesterday's announcement was, a pro-union sort of statement about the money that was supposedly coming to Scotland. Was it supposed to be 80 billion, but it's actually works out to be far less than that as well.
Yeah, was it? Yeah, I suspect the Conservatives have probably given up to an extent in winning a relevant number of seats in Scotland. They can win quite handily with just English seats. And I think, definitely, if I was a Tory politics guy, if I was a strategist, I would be advising antagonize the Scottish political institution, right? Or just be like blatantly sort of disrespectful of requests for referendums or foreign nation approaches to COVID regulations or anything like that. Just like actively and blatantly be dismissive and resentful and sort of spiteful, and try to rile up a cultural conflict that you can translate into determined unionist British nationalist votes down in England. To me, that seems an effective strategy. If you get your base riled up about something, they're more likely to vote for you, which is an important thing for any party to understand. You have to appeal to the base. Triangulating to the center doesn't really seem to work that much. You have to give people who actually do like your party what they like your party for, and not just kind of sort of half-hearted. So I don't think they're honest when they come out with this kind of stuff. I think they know exactly what they're doing. They're being deliberately spiteful and trying to get a rise out of people here, which in turn gets a rise out of the sort of British nationalist base in England. It might even get them like a couple of seats here on the list, because it's a small demographic, but it still is a demographic in Scotland that is fiercely sort of loyalist and unionist and does believe in it. And they will feel more under siege, right? If people around them are getting more riled up by the idea of Britishness as represented by Boris Johnson.
Mm. Let's talk about you. Obviously, you've been in Scotland for a while now, so you were around for the 2014 referendum, and were you actively involved in campaigning for that?
I campaigned, yeah. I wasn't great on the door knocking. Again, I'm very tall, and I feel weird going up to someone's door and knocking and excuse me, talking at them. Just as kind of like, I'm okay. I'm not trying to, I've got long hair and big beard and I'm nearly 2 meters and I walk up to someone's door and I feel like I'm kind of intruding on them, like, hi, here, let me talk to you about. So I did more like stall stuff and like handed out flyers sort of in the city center and a lot of sort of debate attendance stuff. I was still at university in 2014, so we organized a lot of student groups to help with like voter sign up and registration and to make sure people knew where the polling stations were. I wasn't allowed to vote. I'm still not allowed to vote in anything. I'm not only am I not a UK citizen, I'm not even an EU citizen because Switzerland's not in the EU. So I don't even get a general election vote or a Holyrood vote.
Somebody I was speaking to, it's American. Apparently, Holyrood have passed some law that means that people who aren't members of the Commonwealth or whatever can actually vote in the Holyrood elections. I don't know if that's something that's changed.
They have. It's not taken effect yet. I'll have to see if it'll apply for 2021. But as it stands, I don't really get a vote in much of anything. So I campaign instead. I mean, it's nice. It gives me this sort of detached sense where I don't have to feel too sad or upset about things that don't go the way I want them to because, well, what you gonna do? There's a detachment that is good for my mental health at some point because I get to kind of just sit back and go, hey, ruined it again, but not like feel personal guilt that I failed,
Still able
in a
to
way.
do your bit in that respect. Some of the tactics that were used in the 2014 referendum, I wasn't living in Scotland, I was living in England at the time when the referendum, and obviously what we saw in the media, there was seemed to be a lot more emphasis on the no campaign more than the yes campaign, but some of the tactics were pretty low. I mean, for example, pensioners were being told that they'd lose their pensions. I mean, do you think that's going to happen again when there is the next referendum? Because it will. I think it's inevitable. Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts about the inevitability of another independence referendum?
Okay, yeah. I'll address that first, and we can talk about the media stuff. So this is an interesting one. I'm not entirely sure. I think it would be completely within character for a Johnson administration to just blankly turn down any request, no matter what the mandate is. I don't think they have a respect for democracy. I think Boris Johnson himself would be terrified of going down in history as the PM who was in power during the breakup of the UK. That would be something he would not want to have happen. And I think it would be entirely within character for that government to say no. Unfortunately, I'm not really a legal person, so I can't really ruminate over how effective the various strategies being put forward are. But I'm happy that there are strategies being put forward. I think we'll get a lot more clarity from the European support base after January. Right, because the EU isn't, by its own laws, it's not really allowed to intervene in domestic issues of member states. So until the UK is like completely out of the EU, they're going to be a little bit reticent with what they have to say. So I would look to what we get from the EU after January in terms of whether we'd be given speedy access, whether it would even be an issue, whether we can, whether we'd be allowed to pursue sterlingization, which I'm not in favor of, but these kind of issues that would have to be addressed about currency, about sort of international commitments and stuff, which we can't really know at the moment because we're still in this tunnel of Brexit, COVID, and an 80-seat Tory majority. So it's kind of tricky to make an educated guess about what's going to happen. I like that we've got two different paths available to us, and that people are starting to take the plan B a bit more seriously. What I suspect will happen is that something will just come to a boiling point. The S&P is set to win, what, like 72 seats in 2021, something like that?
Polling is pretty good for the S&P.
Yeah.
It's increased, and that as well, it continues to increase. Or is it support for independence is sort of between 54 and 57% on the poll as well. So there's more people in Scotland that want independence now than those that don't. And I think that's possibly why Westminster's starting to get really scared now. And, you know, this is when these start coming out, and this propaganda that we're going to start to see is going to be on the increase for sure.
We're going to get it again, yeah. What I expect will happen is that the S&P will win a strong mandate in 2021. They will submit a request for like a Section 30 referendum. And then if it's denied, there's going to be something in that moment, in that immediate context, in that immediate political time, that will be a viable option forward. So we have to be ready, because it could be a lot of different things. And unfortunately, we don't seem to be that good at diversifying our efforts and our energy. People, especially on the left, kind of have this tendency of trying to find one solution that is the true best solution, because that'll fix everything, right? But it's probably more the case that you have to try a bunch of different things at the same time through a lot of different avenues.
Yeah, there's a court case, I think, that's going on as well, and there are I mean, there's the plan B, and I don't know what it is, but apparently there's a plan C, but I'm not quite sure. I'm sure we'll probably get through quite a few letters of the alphabet with different ideas, you know, what will happen, you know, because obviously there's the original signing in 1707, of course, that as long as 100 people, you know, that we could reach out of the union that way. Do you think if a decision like that was suddenly made, do you think that has to be a referendum, regardless? That has to be that way, and for the people to decide? Because if Scotland suddenly just declares independence from the United Kingdom, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to say, well, hang on a minute, I didn't get a chance to have a say in this.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's going to become less of an issue the further the current tension in the UK gets exacerbated. Like the more the complete hollowing out and just sort of neoliberal accelerationism of the UK state carries on, people are going to be less and less concerned about sort of superficial kind of justifications for things. They'll just want things to actually finally be better. I mean, my country of origin does referendums all the time. We're famous for it. I really don't like the way referendums are done here. People don't seem to really like get it, kind of. Should never have really been a referendum to begin with. For Scottish independence, I don't see how you can really honestly argue that we shouldn't have a referendum, because we've already had one. And that's kind of like it's a way of getting a justification anyway, you know? I mean, if you were being really honest about such a big decision, you might have to say things like, we need to have at least 60% approval rating, you know, like some kind of course, because it is such a big thing. It shouldn't come down to just a referendum. It should be a combination of factors, like a parliamentary majority for a party with a platform for independence, a independent third party readiness in terms of industry and economy, right? A cultural movement that's ready to actually go into this and support it. Part of the reason why Brexit is going so badly is because it just happened, and then they had to do this big, massive project on very short notice. I'm sure you can leave the EU without, you know, making a complete mess of it, but that's a long project that takes about probably 5 to 10 years of getting everything in order with goodwill and good faith, which of course isn't the case here. So just a referendum to me is not the ideal situation for justifying independence, but we kind of have to have one. I'd be happy enough with a multi-layered council and Holyrood and civil, social and cultural institutional readiness for it, and like a more sort of multitudinous kind of popular agreement. I don't know how you can put that into practice, especially when people are very committed to one method or the other. But I mean, like, if you were looking at a situation where 51% was enough to do such a drastic change that would affect 49% of people negatively. Like, that's not necessarily the most democratic way to do something, but that's where we are, because we had a referendum in 2014. Someone thought it was a good idea, and now we kind of have to have a second one.
Yeah, there was obviously, because I mean, of course, a big part of the argument was that to stay in the, if Scotland wanted to stay in the EU, everyone had to vote no.
Yeah,
a massive material change, and
absolutely
justification for another referendum. Though they keep bringing up because Alex Salmond said it's a once in a generation opportunity and all that, and that's just constantly brought out. All the time. They're finding any excuses really to try and stop the country from democratically choosing and deciding its own future.
It's disingenuous pedantry, the once in a generation thing. Look, if the question is in terms of have things changed enough from 2014 to now, then absolutely yes. My God, definitely. They changed the moment that the result was no, and the whole vow thing got scrapped. But the brass neck sheer gall of the lies that were told to ensure a no vote, and the sickening level of institutional power exerted through the media, which is supposed to be an objective and free democratic press. The moral right to have a second referendum was won before the first referendum was even finished, in my opinion. Like, there's no question about that at all. The British state has no moral standing whatsoever, no democratic standing. It has no right-minded authority whatsoever. Unfortunately, that's not enough. You need to have a material, tangible and possibly even a legal backing for it. So it's a tricky needle to thread.
It's the power of that printed media that obviously got the vote in 2014, and could arguably be why the country, the United Kingdom, apart from Scotland, but when you added all the votes together to leave, and it was the power of the print media and all the propaganda that some certain unnamed newspapers seem to publish continuously and continue to do so. I mean, have you found recently, because as we leave in the EU and all that, are you finding yourself being the victim of abuse in any way, shape or form? Because, or is Aberdeen kind of, are you finding it different? I mean, obviously you haven't travelled down to England, maybe.
Yeah.
Hear the stories about what goes on in England. We don't sort of hear it so much in Scotland.
Well, on a personal level, I'm doing quite well. I've maybe been the recipient of bigotry 3 or 4 times in the past few years, and most of that was for being Jewish rather than for being a foreigner. I do know that every single migrant that I know personally who has spent time in Scotland and in England has experienced far more xenophobic and racist behavior in England than in Scotland. That's not to say it doesn't exist in Scotland. They get it here too, every now and again, or more than every now and again. Don't want to be whitewashing that kind of stuff, especially after what we saw in George Square just a couple of weeks ago. But it very much is a British nationalist expression of anger. And because the identity of Britain gets conflated with England, the same way the Soviet Union kind of got conflated with Russia, in terms of what is the main cultural force in this union, it does obviously have a geographical bias towards England. If we look at some stats, you might remember that after the Leave referendum passed, there was a spike in hate crimes targeted towards Romanians and Lithuanians and Poles and other Eastern Europeans, including deaths. If I remember correctly, the spike was recorded in England and Wales. It was not recorded in Scotland, which is unsurprising because Scotland voted entirely to remain, which coincidentally is a great example of how a political party can actually change the overall opinion of the populace and doesn't have to be a reactive force, always catering to what they think people want. So personal abuse, no. But of course, I'm very aware that there is this coalescing right-wing, imperial revanchist, nostalgic British nationalist rage that is coalescing around Brexit. It's the reason why the Tories have a impenetrable vote floor of 40%. Like, when was the last time the Conservative vote share went below 40% in terms of polling? I can't remember it happening ever. There's such a strong, baked in, angry populace that will, is just behind those set of values no matter what. In terms of the media, well, the discourse today that I mentioned earlier, I think before we started, is that Guardian article about the Red Wall. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't. No.
No. Okay. So the Guardian published an article entitled "The View from the Red Wall," right? And it was what happened. Where did all these Labour seats go? Right. This north of England area that was traditionally a Labour heartland, and that almost entirely flipped to the Conservatives in 2019. Right. So they published this article, which is meant to be an explanation of the view of the working class traditional Labour voter in the Red Wall, and they have three people in the article. The first is a 16-year-old who's not in the workforce. Great. The second is a nurse who says she voted Tory because she's concerned about immigration in her 97% white area, and then says she's also concerned about not having enough nurses in the NHS. And you're like, well, I wonder, where they all went. But then the third person is a restaurant owner. He owns an artisanal pizza restaurant. And a little bit of digging found out that this guy is related. His brother is a property manager in the same area, and that they're personal friends with, what's her name, Piddle, the Guardian editor for the North of England.
Right.
And she had previously done an interview with him last month about the Dominic Cummings thing, where he had to go at the BBC instead of Cummings. So this is a personal friend of the Guardian editor who is being taken out as representative of the working class. Now, apart from the idiocy of using a restaurant owner, someone who owns capital, who pays employees to do his work for him and to make money for him as working class, the fact that they are personally related, they have a personal friendship with the editor of this paper, is sickening. They're going to keep doing it. There is an institutional inacceptance to move away from the nepotism and the power structures in the media. It's definitely going to happen again. We need to be prepared. They will throw everything at us. We saw what they did to Corbyn over 5 years. I mean, I wasn't a Corbyn supporter for a couple of issues, but overall I thought he was a decent guy. And I was especially mad about the anti-Semitism smears, because a lot of his positions are not anti-Semitic. They're just pro-Palestinian or they're critical of Israel. And as a Jewish person in the diaspora who is also critical of Israel, I find it sickening that the right wing just makes up anti-Semitism and stuff, because that just muddies the waters and it makes it harder to tell what's real and what isn't. And that goes back to hurt me. Anyway, 5 years of he's a spy for the Czechs and the Soviets. He's in Hamas. He's in the IRA. My God, which of course we recognize very well from the 2012 to 2014, so the campaign period. But it's definitely going to happen again. They just never stop. The only saving grace we have is that during COVID-19, paper news sales are dying out, which is good and should be applauded. And what we need to be doing is not just enacting our political change through like on the ground campaigns and like physical movements and handing out flyers and knocking on doors and doing all the direct action stuff. We need to be replacing the avenues of narrative, right? The media structures. We need to be supplanting them and replacing them with our side. And I'm not even going to pretend to say we have to be fair, right? We because the other side doesn't play fair. We need to actively stake out a level of propaganda power for our interests, because that's the only way you actually have fairness, right? If one side is putting out biased propaganda material, you can't have an opposition to that with something that's neutral and objective. Because if you're neutral in the face of aggression, then you're not neutral. You're going to be subsumed by it. So you have to have an equally opposing force of active bias and active propaganda for our interests. Because it's not about, being the smartest person or writing the best article or having the fairest view of events. It's about putting your position forward and winning support for your ideology and for your position.
Social media now has got more
Yeah.
and more powerful,
Yeah.
than 6 years ago. And the influence, people are getting pulled up on a tweet that they tweeted 10 years ago, and then they get hounded out. We're going back to Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, he was hounded out of his job effectively by the print media.
Pretty much, yeah.
And of course now we've got Keir Starmer. They've got Keir Starmer in the, and he seems to be maybe the more acceptable face. And I'm wondering, who put him in that position? Is it the media that puts these people in the position and think, all right, he's all right as opposition? So I think social media is definitely going to have a bigger influence on any independence referendum. And I completely get your point that the only way to fight fire is with fire.
Yeah, it's not just social media. I think that gets a little bit personal, and people get trapped in individualistic approaches. We need to have a structure that manages to do structural outreach, which means YouTube channels that don't do arguments but just present things, present information. Podcasts that do the same, right? The massive popularity of Chapo Trap House has probably radicalized a fair number of people in the US. I would not be surprised. That's an important part of modern political action. You have to have alternate media structures that are not used to react to things or to argue against attacks, that aren't used on the defensive, but that are used to actively ignore the other side and just put out your own position and try to get that position into as many people's monitors as possible. Because if we get caught up fighting against what we see as unfair, targeted sort of hatchet jobs by the establishment media, we're losing sight of the big picture. We're going to end up fighting them on their terms, right? And if you see, well, this if an outside observer sees that a serious, well-respected BBC journalist or a Guardian journalist or a well-respected media establishment is in conflict with a bunch of people on Twitter or Facebook, there's an optic imbalance there that we need to address, and we have to do it by having our own actual structures that can do the attacks and not always be defensive. So more content basically.
With such as stations like this, in Indie Radio Live and Independence Live, and there's a number of stations. And obviously, my programs are talking to people, new Scots, regarded as new Scots, and to talk about independence and some of the arguments that people get. And that's really what it's all about here. Let's move on a bit now. Let's look to the future. It's been a referendum or Plan B or Plan C or whatever has happened, and Scotland has gained its independence. Do you think, as a nation, Scotland will struggle?
To begin with, of course. I mean, it'd be dishonest to say otherwise. There's going to be like a period, but the reason why that struggle isn't going to actually affect anyone negatively is for the very simple fact that when you have borrowing powers, you can actually run an economic program and platform that safeguards people's lives and their comfort. At the moment, those things get disregarded for capital, business interests, or for projecting international power, or for ideological reasons because they hate poor people. But it's going to be difficult in like an overall sense, but it doesn't have to hit the actual people. It's a country of 5.5 million. You can easily make sure everyone is safe and comfortable, with a relative level of luxury for however long the transition period is. You just need to have the right economic beliefs in power. And this is where I am a little bit skeptical of the SNP being the organization to carry us forward past independence. I don't think their behavior in terms of the rent protection bill, for example, that they approved at conference but then failed to pass when it came into Parliament. I'm worried that their interests are too wedded to the neoliberal business side of things, and that they will not do what's needed to make sure that the actual people of this country, the sovereign Scottish people, are protected and are benefiting from independence, because independence definitely is the best thing for us in the long run, partly because we would finally have the actual power to do the things we need to directly benefit us. And I would be interested in seeing a much wider variety of parties with progressive and new policies and beliefs to choose from post-independence. The SNP currently are the most progressive of the options on the table, except for the Scottish Greens, but they have a different issue with geographic spread. That's I like the Scottish Greens. I wish they were more popular than they are. But if you look at the sort of the main historical options, SNP, Labour, and Tory, the SNP are the least likely to actually, really harm people. Going forward, yeah, that's pretty much it. It doesn't need to be difficult. It's going to be in the big picture thing, getting all the international treaties organized and getting all this, the sort of finding our place in the big complicated bureaucratic sort of international framework, of course, is going to be tricky, but it doesn't need to be difficult for the people who live here.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully, of course, fast track to the EU. I know you sort of talk about, because Scotland is, when I moved here, I found Scotland to be more of a European country than England.
Absolutely.
And that's the real feel I got when I first came here. But hopefully, obviously, as you mentioned, that the EU are probably once the UK is completely out, then they probably might become more vocal about their thoughts, and that'd be interesting whether that's going to influence people's opinions in the United Kingdom about Scottish independence, for example. If they're making statements about, would they be able to say, for example, they're annoyed that a country such as Scotland voted to stay in the EU, yet got dragged out against its will.
Yeah, it's just another example of the massive democratic deficit that exists, and especially because it's a first past the post system, where, arguably every region, every area in the UK has this same problem, right? And when people bring that up, I would say, well, I would be entirely behind the campaign for Cornish independence, or, Northumbrian, whatever. It happens all the time. Prior to the sort of rise of the SNP, the big issue was that Scotland routinely voted Labour as a majority of seats, which ended up being completely irrelevant because the larger seat share in England means that whatever England actually decides ends up being the case. And if you can point to a distinct sort of political culture in the two countries, which I think you can, that makes the argument for you. And the EU is just another sort of iteration of that. Whether, the level of involvement we should have with the EU, I think, is up for debate. Membership, to me, seems a no-brainer. Like, absolutely, yes. Even if it's just for like a 15 or 20 year sort of transition period, and if we then decide that actually maybe we'd like to do something else in 20 years time, so much can happen in 20 years time, there's always the option, and we have the template for how not to do it now, which is
Very true. And I always like to end interviews we'll end on a little bit of a lighter note in some respects. And one question I like to ask new Scots when I speak to them is, what would you say to people who may be contemplating on thinking of coming to Scotland to live? What would you say to somebody who thought about making Scotland their home?
In good conscience, I'm not sure if I can advocate it right now. No, obviously it's a great place to live. I've had it was the best thing that ever happened to me coming up here 10 years ago. Even though I moved from a country that has a stronger welfare state and takes better care of its people because it has a much stronger economy, I'm still much happier here, and I have a better existence being here. If you're thinking of moving up here right now, right at the moment, probably don't. We're dealing with the virus pretty well, so maybe just let's just keep things kind of iffy just for right now, but check back in 5 or 6 months and see what the crack is.
We should be closed. Because that's
yeah,
you think it should be. There's been a lot of because I saw on social media there was a sign. I won't say the words because I can't say them at this time of the evening, as it were, on air. That there was up on just on the border of Cornwall, which was basically telling people to go away, shall we say, in a nice, polite way. Yet when there were people on the border of Scotland, they were on the border of Scotland and England, which according to Jackson Carlisle doesn't exist. And they were accused of being xenophobic to the English. It seems to be didn't make any sense to me.
No, of course. I mean, any opportunity to attack the enemy of the establishment. Dawn Butler, the Labour MP, has been hounded out of her constituency office for violent threats, right? And she is getting none of the attention that what was it, Anna Soubry or whatever these right-wing MPs were getting over the past year. Luciana Berger, hiring 2 security guards to escort her through like an empty auditorium. But people who were on the other side of the argument do something, a stunt, and it becomes weaponized. This is where a potential, Scottish media apparatus could go on the offensive and start posting pictures of the George Square protesters Sieg Heiling with the Union Jacks behind them, But again, that was just some football hijinks and nothing important and not respective really of any cultural force. Yeah, it's depressing. That's the media thing. But yeah, no, definitely come up here. It's much better than than it gets portrayed as in the media. It's a great place.
Except for the weather.
I like the weather. I don't do well in the heat. I get annoyed. I start sweating at like 15 degrees. It's not good.
Yeah, I've got kind of acclimatized when I live down south and that. And I saw a post, you get these posts come up on Facebook. Oh, you posted this like 4 years ago.
Yeah.
There's a post and it said, oh, it's 24 degrees outside. And I went, I wish. And now if it's 24 degrees now outside, I can't hack it. It's too hot. I was walking out 17 degrees outside today and I was walking down the road in a T-shirt. If I told myself, back then, that at 17 degrees, we go, yeah, right, whatever. But now if it gets over 17, 18 degrees, it's just too hot for me. I can't stand it. So seeing some of the heat wave down south, I don't know, I'd have a heat stroke, I think, at 24 degrees, 25 degrees. Just too much for me now. But you get, I've got acclimatized to it. I don't mind the weather really, but there is obviously the misconception that it always rains in Scotland. It doesn't always. I mean, on the east coast, it's different from the west coast because we've,
Yeah, but I mean, what? Because England's a tropical paradise. Like, oh no, my God, slightly more rain.
Thanks ever so much for taking time to speak to me today. Much appreciated.
No worries, mate. Thanks for having me.
That was Elijah talking to me last month. If you'd like to share your experiences with me and our audience, drop me an email to studio@indylive.radio.
This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
That's all for this week. Until next time, stay safe